The YouTuber Shaun recently made a video in which he defended the common practice of casting figures from European history, culture, and myth as non-whites. Shaun was responding to a video by Mark Collett, which interpreted this practice as functioning to weaken the European people's sense of their histories and consequently of their identities.
A group of people who do not have knowledge of their own history cannot understand their true place in the world. Those who do not know of their own culture cannot preserve that culture. People who do not know of the great deeds and the great achievements of their own ancestors will never know of their rightful inheritance. Ultimately, a group of people without a history is a group of people who have no future.
Collett argues that globalist political forces are seeking, for political purposes, to efface white people's perception of their past. He who controls the present controls the past, he who controls the past controls the future kind of thing. Shaun falsely claims that Collett describes this as a cultural Marxist plot.
Mark then concludes that all this is a deliberate cultural Marxist plot to undermine Western civilization.
Collett doesn't actually say anything about cultural Marxism. Shaun also spends a lot of time claiming that his opponent advocates fascism.
And we need to come together and defend Europe by becoming fascists.
Terms like fascist and racist are used pretty broadly these days, probably even more broadly than the term cultural Marxism. As I see it, if the arguments are good, it doesn't matter who's making them, and Shaun is claiming that the arguments are bad.
So what do we think about this video? Well, it is riddled with historical inaccuracies for a start. Before we get to the arguments here, I'm going to have to get my red pen out and do a little correcting.
So Shaun makes some historical arguments, and I'm going to be assessing these. Let's start with the case of Black Doctor Who, which Shaun justifies on the grounds that there's a story of a black man being adopted by a British Army unit, that some black abolitionists spent time in Britain in the 19th century, which he strangely relates to the Atlantic slave trade. Of course, the Atlantic slave trade didn't go anywhere near Britain, so it's hard to see what the argument is here, but Shaun explains to us that he has an unbeatable research tool.
Well, let me reveal one of my tricks of the trade to you right here. What I do when I want to find out about stuff, for example, if there's any pictures of black Victorians, is head over to Google and type in black Victorians and do an image search.
Yes, Google image search, the gold standard in historical research. For instance, here's what comes up if I search for European people history. It turns out that the history of European people consisted primarily of blacks. But concerning Doctor Who, there's a simpler way to see what was going on. This wasn't the first time they'd tried to turn Doctor Who black. It's clear from the words of the executive producer of the show that this was a policy decision based on a determination to insert more non-whites into white cultural icons. In fact, it gets even clearer. We've kind of got to tell a lie. We'll go back into history, and there will be black people where historically there wouldn't have been, and we won't dwell on that. We'll say, to hell with it, this is the imaginary better version of the world. By believing in it, we'll summon it forth. So we have a direct admission from a Doctor Who executive producer that the presence of blacks was intended to be a lie about the past, a lie told for the purpose of transforming present-day society. So much for Shaun's argument. As for the black British soldier Shaun mentioned, his name was Jimmy Durham. Some British troops found him as an orphaned infant after a battle, and their commander adopted him as a regimental pet. That's a direct quote. He was made into a regimental pet. In 1899, at the age of 14, he was allowed to enlist. So the basis on which Shaun suggests that British cultural figures in the 19th century should be depicted as black is that some British troops adopted an orphaned black baby and let him join the regiment when he grew up since he didn't have anything else. Clearly no good deed goes unpunished, since these men are being rewarded for their kindness towards this black infant by having their people's history erased and their descendants displaced in their own homeland. Shaun's other solidly historical argument concerns a BBC series for children. Here's how he describes the issue.
A BBC cartoon about life in Roman Britain that showed a black Roman soldier.
And here's how it was defined in the video he's supposedly rebutting.
In the BBC series, The Story of Britain, which was in fact a cartoon and of course aimed at children, we saw black Roman soldiers, black Celts, black Iron Age blacksmiths, black Norman priests, and black English noblemen.
So Shaun is going to try to show that having a black Roman commander is historically accurate, but this doesn't suffice to explain the black Norman priests or the black Iron Age Britons and so on. But I'll try to address Shaun's argument concerning the Romans. Shaun has two examples, both closely linked. First, the Emperor Septimius Severus, who Shaun argues is non-white on the basis of his Libyan birth and his depiction on the Severan Tondo. Second, there's a passage from the Historia Augusta in which Severus sees an Ethiopian legionary well in Britain. I'll start by talking about Severus, then I'll move to the Historia Augusta and the Ethiopian. Severus was born on the Libyan coast in the old Punic city of Leptis Magna. There's some controversies concerning his identity. Some authors have tried to give him a Punic identity, and thus to associate him with Hannibal as something alien to Rome. Others have stressed his Italian origins and that he behaved like a normal Roman official. On the latter side, I'll take an example of the article by T.D. Burns. On the former side, a book by Anthony Burley. The subtitle of this book, The African Emperor, alludes to the Roman province of Africa, of course, not to sub-Saharan Africa. You'll notice the Severintando on the cover, which is the piece of art which Shaun used to argue for Severus as a non-white. It's an interesting work, and yes, it does show Severus' skin as darker than the rest of his family's. One problem is that we don't know the circumstances of its creation. It's thought to have been created in Egypt, but we have no knowledge of whether it was done from life, or whether the artist just knew that Severus was from Libya and painted him in the image of whatever kind of Libyan he knew of. Severus' sons are shown as pale-skinned, which may have some implications. We also have sculptures of Severus which depict him as of European appearance, and also those of his sons, Caracalla and Gita, are of European appearance, so the artistic evidence is inconclusive. As far as genealogical evidence is concerned, Barnes says that it is far from certain that Septimius Severus was Punic by race. The evidence is all but conclusive that both his mother's and his father's families were of Italian stock. I should point out that the word race is being used in the broad sense here. Burley, in contrast, emphasizes the importance of Punic identity and language in Leptis Magna, and goes into considerable speculative detail in an appendix concerning Severus' possible Punic ancestors, which may well be correct, but it's pretty hard to see how having some ancestry from elite Punic families in a Phoenician city on the southern Mediterranean coast is supposed to make Severus non-white. Now let's turn to Shaun's other example, the Ethiopian soldier from the Historia Augusta. Let me start out with a little background on the term Ethiopian in Roman usage. We associate it with the country of Ethiopia, and if that were the case here, then we'd have to talk about the racial stock of various Ethiopian populations. You might remember Gibbon's description of them as a colony of Arabs, in contrast to the true Negroes. Even today, they're not exactly classical sub-Saharan Africans. For instance, see these pictures of the Ethiopian leader Haile Selassie. But the use of the term Ethiopian in the Historia Augusta probably doesn't mean the people of the modern country of Ethiopia. The Romans were often rather sloppy ethnographers and nowhere more than in their terminology. Just think of the annoyingly contradictory and vague use of the term Scythian. The term Ethiopians know better. Sometimes it's associated with a true sub-Saharan African appearance, with puffy lips, woolly hair, dark skin, and a flat nose. But on other occasions, the Romans would label people as Ethiopians if they had darker skin than usual, even if they had relatively little sub-Saharan African ancestry. The nomadic desert tribes of northwest Africa are one of the main examples of people labeled as Ethiopians. And if there were Ethiopians in the Roman army in Britain, they would be the best candidates. Now let me finally get to looking at the passage from the Historia Augusta. It says that when Severus saw the Ethiopian soldier, he was spooked by his ominous color. And yes, that does mean the dark coloration was ominous. That was a conventional Roman belief, and it's also made very clear in what happens a little after when Severus makes sacrifices. So if Severus himself was dark-skinned, as Shaun seems to think, why would he be spooked by the dark skin of this Ethiopian? But there's a more serious issue, namely, why are we trusting Historia Augusta? Anyone who studied the history of the Roman Empire even little knows that it's not to be relied on. It has so many clear falsehoods that it's been considered as a hoax or a prank or who knows what. But Shaun just treats an anecdote from the Historia Augusta as absolute truth, not to be questioned. Does he really not know anything about the Historia Augusta, or did he deliberately mislead his audience? In any case, the two works we looked at concerning Severus, the book by Burley and the article by Barnes, show us how serious people treat the Historia Augusta. In Barnes' article, and remember that Barnes is arguing that Severus was a good Italian, Barnes says that Severus' respect for Roman tradition is shown in two stories in the Historia Augusta. That is, these stories from the Historia Augusta help Barnes' case. But, he adds, of the truth of which there is of course no guarantee. Then he tells the stories, and concludes, yet all anecdotes in the Historia Augusta ought to be regarded with suspicion, since so many can be proved false. These anecdotes help his case, but he's quick to remind the reader that they shouldn't be trusted, because this is the Historia Augusta. The same occurs in Burley's book, and this time it concerns the very passage about the Ethiopian which Shaun used as evidence. But let me back up and give a bit of information taken from Burley about the structure of the Historia Augusta's biography of Severus, and where the passage about the Ethiopian lies within it. The meat of the biography, as Burley tells us, is in the first part, which then sort of breaks off into incoherence, after which there's an interlude ripped off from Aurelius Victor, quoting Burley, The author then presumably decided that he had ended the work too abruptly and added some more, much of it fiction, omens of death, and some miscellaneous items, particularly on Septimius' death and burial. The anecdote concerning the Ethiopian comes with those omens of death. Burley notes that Cassius Dio also gives a story of a death omen, but only one, but Dio doesn't include the story of the Ethiopian, which may be significant since he's more reliable than the Historia Augusta. In contrast, the Historia Augusta skips over Severus' campaigns, but gives 4 death omens, one of which is seeing the Ethiopian. Burley likes the story, and it helps his argument, but he too cautions that the story could be the product of the author's own imagination. Unlike Shaun, serious people use the Historia Augusta with caution, even when it helps their case. That was a lot of detail to go into concerning a minor anecdote, but I think it's important to show how shallow the scholarship Shaun's relying on is. Now we can move from straight-up history to culture and myth, including cultural depictions of history. Shaun mainly handwaves at cases like Black Guinevere, Black Friar Tuck, Black Achilles, and so on, although Achilles is golden-haired in the sources, it's often emphasized, but never mind. Of course, there are other examples I could give, like Black Anna Karenina, Black Hamlet, Black King Lear, the BBC turning Normans black in an actual history program about the Norman conquest. You get the idea. The only example Shaun really contends with is Sir Lancelot. Shaun responds to this by mentioning Morian, a knight who appears in a Dutch language Arthurian tale. Morian was Moorish or half Moorish, and he's depicted as black. But first of all, this doesn't justify making Lancelot black. In fact, the whole tale of Morian wouldn't even make sense if Lancelot were black, because the entire point of Morian being black is to make him different from everyone else so that people think he's a monster and so on. Second, Shaun doesn't understand the genre of medieval romance. Medieval romance loved the exotic, so of course it has characters from far off. Naturally. If you think of Don Quixote, which is, among other things, a parody of medieval romances, you'll remember Don Quixote's imagined voyage to the Kingdom of Kandy on modern-day Sri Lanka. By Shaun's logic, you would say, oh, well, this justifies making Don Quixote a South Asian character. That's absurd. The whole story of encounters with the exotic and far off is just part of the genre of medieval romance. But if you bring these exotic characters into the center of the story, as with Black Lancelot, you destroy the whole structure. Third, if you read the tale of Morian, it's clear that it's a bit of a stretch to call him a Knight of the Round Table. He's clearly the hero of a tale from Arthurian legend, but he's not part of the assemblage of knights that make up Arthur's court. In his tale, he never sits at the Round Table. He meets Lancelot and Gawain, he spends some time with him, he goes off and has some adventures of his own, he meets back up with Arthur's knights to deal with a crisis. Gawain tells Arthur their story, and Arthur gives Morian rewards. Then Morian goes off with some of Arthur's knights, including his father, to restore his mother to their throne. The end. He's a one-time character, a piece of exotica, whose course intersects heroically with the Knights of the Round Table in one episode before he departs again. If the Knights of the Round Table were a TV show, he would be the guest star in one episode, not part of the regular cast. And let me remind you that the point of all this is supposed to be to justify making Lancelot black, which it clearly does not. Shaun even tries to find a non-white Arthurian knight in the character of the Green Knight from Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. But clearly Shaun didn't bother to actually read Gawain and the Green Knight, which, by the way, is definitely worth it. You should read it in the original if at all possible. It's a bit difficult starting out, but if you can read Shakespeare, maybe Spenser's Faerie Queene to get some old-fashioned vocabulary, then you can read Chaucer in the original, and if you'd read some Chaucer, maybe something like the stanzaic Morte d'Arthur, the alliterative Morte d'Arthur as practice, then you shouldn't have too much trouble taking a stab at Gawain, which is great fun. You should also read the poem Pearl, presumably by the same poet. But leaving aside my Middle English reading suggestions, the point is that if you read Gawain and the Green Knight, whether in the original or in modern English, you'll find that the Green Knight is actually only green under the enchantment of Morgan Le Fay. His actual name is Bredelac de Hautezert. It's actually the central plot point of Gawain and the Green Knight that Gawain stays in Bredelac's castle, not knowing that Bredelac, his host, is actually the Green Knight whom he has to meet and at whose hands he presumably has to die. We even know that Bredelac, that is the Green Knight when he's not enchanted, is a big man with a reddish-brown beard, it's called beaver-hued, and a fiery face. There's sort of a red-green dynamic, with contrast between his greenness when enchanted and his ruddy face and beard in his natural form. But there's no question that he's a white man, so there's another example where Shaun just didn't do his research. The other cultural example that Shaun contests is the English Queen Margaret of Anjou as depicted in Shakespeare's histories.
Anyway, next up, let's talk about Sophie Okonedo playing Queen Margaret in that television adaptation of Shakespeare. Now, the important point here is that she is not playing Margaret, the historical figure. She is playing Margaret, the Shakespeare character.
It's a pretty extreme doctrine that Shaun espouses, and I doubt that he really takes it seriously. Shaun is saying that cultural depictions of history don't really have anything to do with history, so that if you were casting a film about a battle between Zulus and whites in South Africa, it would be fine to have a white actor play the Zulu king. But we all know no one would actually make a historical drama and have a white man play a Zulu king, and if they did, there would be an uproar. Nor is it really credible that this is just a matter of casting the best actor. I've seen a lot of modern British Shakespeare productions, both from live productions recorded on video by, say, the Royal Shakespeare Company or the National Theatre or Shakespeare's Globe, and those which are made as movies or BBC series. It seems to be almost mandatory for modern British production of a Shakespeare history to include a black actor or two, and it's very clear that there's huge affirmative action. As Shakespeare actors, the black characters are just frequently jarringly inferior to the rest of the cast. It's clearly another case of lying about the past in order to influence the present, as the Doctor Who executive producer said. Again, the Orwellian overtones are very heavy. I won't hammer the point home too heavy-handedly, but yes, controls present, controls past, controls future, all of that, it is very clearly at work here. By now, I've pretty much exhausted Shaun's arguments concerning the erasure of whites from their own history and culture. The rest of his video is devoted to an attack on European identity. This clip gets the flavor of it.
To wrap up here, by reducing the various peoples in Europe to nothing but their skin colours, and by coaching their followers to identify with being white and nothing else, Mark Collett and his fascist pals are the ones writing people out of their own histories.
But no one is suggesting that people should identify as white and nothing else. Of course, the French should identify with their history and culture, the English should identify with their history and culture, the Germans should identify with their history and their culture, and so on. European identitarians don't want to erase particular cultural identities, but they do realize that Europeans have an underlying common identity and common interest in repelling the encroachments of non-Europeans on European territory. Shaun says that the fact that Europeans have fought each other means that there's no European identity. If this argument worked, then a family squabble would mean that your family doesn't exist. It's normal for people to have concentric circles of loyalty. As the saying goes, myself against my brothers, myself and my brothers against my cousins, myself and my brothers and my cousins against the world. Well, the same thing works with peoples and nations. Finally, Shaun points to Muslim Spain as a problem for European identity.
And I'll end with a question to Mark Collett or any of his fans that may be watching. Is Spain European? Do the country of Spain and its inhabitants count as European? And does its history count as European history?
The implied argument seems to be that if Shaun can establish any ambiguity around the edges of European history, then European history and identity can't really exist. But this kind of argument is really dodgy. Consider the Alps. Where is their exact boundary? You can imagine not being able to decide whether some foothills are really part of the Alps or not, but this ambiguity doesn't mean that the Alps don't exist. To give a more direct answer to the question, Spain is certainly a part of Europe geographically, but Europe is more than a geographic expression. It suffered an intrusion from the non-European world, just as the Balkans did with the Ottomans. That intrusion was fought back over the course of centuries, and the Moors were expelled from Spain. Would Shaun argue that the Mongol or Manchu conquests of China undermine Chinese identity, or that China's changing boundaries across history imply that China doesn't exist? Of course not. Muslim Spain existed on European soil. It was a non-European regime, some but not all of whose people were Europeans. If you're like me, you were probably indoctrinated in school with stories about how great Muslim Spain is, so I'll mention Dario Fernandez Morera's book, The Myth of the Andalusian Paradise, as a useful corrective to that particular idealized picture. But however one assesses it, the Muslim occupation of Spain does not refute concepts of European identity and history. It represents a contraction of Europe proper for a time. Not everything that happens on European soil is equally European. Some things that happen within Europe are foreign intrusions, like the Ottoman invasions and occupation. They are contractions of Europe. Some things that happen outside of Europe are expansions of Europe, like the European settlement in North America, for instance. To wrap up, I've shown that Shaun's arguments are superficial, unscholarly, and inaccurate. They don't in any way justify the erasure and denaturing of European history and culture that is now taking place. I'd also like Shaun and his fans to think about the contradictions of their position. It's striking that Shaun supports the same program of mass immigration that Mark Zuckerberg does. We now have very clear evidence that racial diversity in an area reduces the people's solidarity and the strength of their community. It makes them weaker and less able to resist the demands of big businesses that don't care about their future. The old saying on the left is that the people united will never be defeated. And that's correct. But racial diversity serves to ensure that the people will never be united. Globalists like Zuckerberg are eagerly trying to increase racial diversity in Western countries so as to reduce resistance to their exploitation and to their strip mining of our economies, to turn us into the cows of their herds, the workers on their plantation. And Shaun, avowed opponent of unfettered capitalism, is carrying water for them. So I'd like to challenge Shaun and his fans to stop seeking approval by parroting the opinions expected of them, and to consider why they're on the same side of the vital immigration battle as the world's largest and most corrupt corporations. You're not using them, Shaun. They're using you.